Hello and welcome back to One-on-One Shadowboxing. My fellow shadowboxer today is Christabel Chamoret. Christabel, we've been talked about the feeling of the method of reforming people in our society. You also mentioned you met with lots of people in the prison who are committed serious crimes like child sex abuse.
Well, it was my experience working in the prison that led me to see how many men had actually suffered this in their childhood without necessarily even recognising it or realising it was an issue. After I did 10 years in the prison system, I worked for 10 years in private practice, and I worked a lot with women who were adult survivors of child sexual abuse. And a lot of the work I'd done in the prison helped me with that because it wasn't really available in our training. And I saw a pattern, which is that women who've been abused are more at risk of becoming repeat victims, and men who have been abused are more at risk of becoming offenders. Not all do, but almost everyone who offends against a child has had a trauma of some kind, either violence or sexual abuse or neglect in their own background. And so that made me very convinced to try and provide treatment for all adult survivors of childhood adversity of any kind. And I was very lucky to be part of a group that was set up by Les Harrison, a principal clinical psychologist at the Department of Community Development in those days, called Sexual Assault in Families program, SAFE, S-A-I-F. And basically it was a brilliant program set up in 1989. He rang me up and he said, Christabel, is it true that we don't offer treatment to men who admit they have a problem and want to stop? And there's no program in the community. And I said, no, there's no program in the community. There's only the ad hoc work that some private practitioners like I do because of what we've learned. I said, but there's no treatment in the prison either because we're only just setting up a sex offender treatment program. And he said, don't you think that's wrong? And he said he had some money and we could set up a community-based treatment program. So we had a little poster and we advertised and we said, if your child is at risk from you, contact this confidential phone line, ring Sexual Assault in Families. And in that first year, in 1989, 80 men didn't just ring up, they came and engaged in a 2-year treatment program we devised. We then added in family programs for the partners and for the children, and for 20 years that program operated. It changed its name in '97 to Safe Care, and I became the director of it at that time, and it was doing magnificent work in the community with the holistic problem, and really over that time we really were succeeding in helping find an alternative way for people to heal and for families to recover from this extraordinarily damaging experience of abuse. It worked very well over 20 years, but
so what's happened after 20 years?
Unfortunately, it was a casualty to that political attitude we were discussing earlier about politicians feeling that everybody has to be locked up and the key thrown away. So in 2009, when the state government changed, the new Minister for Child Protection decided that even though we'd been evaluated and our funding doubled, that we couldn't have any money if we were going to treat the men. So all our money...
Simple as that.
Simple as that. We had to close. And the money that we had gained, the double funding, was given to the Women and Children's Program and given to another agency, Uniting Care West. And the men's work ceased except for a few of us who remained in private practice. So we're now continuing in private practice to offer community-based treatment.
But this could not be as broad as was before.
No, not nearly as good, and not as helpful for the families.
So what is the reaction? Anyone missing your program?
We've got more kudos and more praise since we closed, because we, of course, had a bit of opposition when we were existing. It was such a cutting-edge project, but no, everybody is recognising. And I think I get a call a week from somebody who could have come into the program. I get at least once a month somebody saying to me, do you think Safe Care could reopen? It does happen that people now recognise it was providing a very powerful alternative, and the current system doesn't work. There's not enough sex offender treatment programs in prison for the people that we're locking up, and there's certainly not enough in the community. If we want to intervene and protect children, we have to actually offer treatment at all levels, both to the people that are at risk of offending and those that are unhealed victims.
Yeah.
And we have to keep producing the evidence which is available in the very small areas where treatment is carried out, that it's a really successful intervention and it's very, very helpful to families.
And is that too hard to understand for the communities?
It's not popular, Tibor.
Not popular. That's it.
Yeah.
You couldn't vote. You couldn't win a vote on that.
It's because you've asked me the question. I mean, can you imagine I would get asked this question anywhere else? It's really great that there is an opportunity to express it as a view, but it doesn't get asked very often, or certainly not often enough.
And we heard, and the community is definitely aware of that, the so-called stranger danger. Mm. You know, someone is around the school looking for the kids to capture and to abuse. And think, what's the reality?
The reality is far different. That is a tiny minority that gets all the publicity. About over 90%, and even maybe 98% of sexual offending occurs within the family or within the family network of known people.
And in the
human
homes
beings
of the families.
And in the homes. And often it's an adolescent who's already been damaged themselves, who's acting out. And if we could actually get into those situations really early and provide healing and support, then it would not necessarily progress to actually acting out and endangering more children. So really there is hope, and it's working with the whole family that's the best outline. But even if an offender is caught, if they are offered some treatment that helps them, then that will break the cycle of reoffending in a way that prison simply doesn't.
No. How can you tip the balance and convince the offender not to do that? How does it work psychologically?
Well, it's easy really, because I haven't met many offenders at all who think what they've done is correct. But they don't have a hope that they can change. So what you need to do is to help them to understand the things that triggered in their own lives. And every story is unique. It's not a formula. And nobody's born that way. Nobody's born to abuse a child. It's something that is learnt, unfortunately, through things that people experience in childhood. Not always sexual abuse themselves, sometimes violence, often neglect. Neglect is much more damaging than either sexual abuse or violence, because, at least for a child growing up with a dysfunctional relationship where there may be violence and sexual abuse, that is able to, the relationship can be worked with. But a child who doesn't have any relationships and is really neglected is more at risk. So anyway, those factors can be addressed, and once the person themselves or herself gets in touch with those issues that have caused the problem, they really change and they become less at risk. It's not the adult in the person that offends against the child, it's the damaged child in that adult that actually acts out and doesn't have insight into how much damage is being done, because they don't have insight into how much damage they have received. So we have a view in our treatment program that unless you can get a person to recognise their own childhood feelings, then they don't fully understand the harm they've caused, and they've got less chance of actually knowing not to repeat it. So that empathy for themselves can give them empathy for the child. I often say it's not till about 3/4 of the way through treatment that a sex offender can realise fully the enormity of the damage, and that's a really difficult time for them.
So that's why you need at least 2 years for the healing process and the understanding.
That's what we had. We had 2 years of a year of intensive treatment and a year of follow-up, because we were doing family reunification and we needed to ensure safety. Right now, because of the constraints, it's compressed into a 20 or 30-week program. We've got 2 programs running each year.
Yes.
I run one from Fremantle, and Peter Dunlop, a colleague of mine, runs one from Shenton Park. So there's 2 a year in the community, and it's very inadequate. What I've done is broken down a 40-week program into basically 20 to 30 weeks. And it's not ideal.
Short.
It is short, but it's costly and intensive, and it works very, very well. with the people who come. It's just that it's such a limited resource to offer in such a big community where it's such a big problem.
I have to ask this question, probably unpopular as well. Have we got women sex offenders, child sex offenders in our society?
Yes, yes, we do. And one of the things I've discovered in the 40 years that I've been researching this is that if a child is abused by the same gender offender, they're more at risk of developing an offending pattern. Now, not all go on to do that, but most boys are abused by older boys or men, and they become at risk of offending. There are other boys who've been abused by older girls or women. They do not go on to be at risk of offending, but they do go on to be at risk of repeat victimisation. And for women, most girls are abused by older boys or men, so they're not at risk of offending, but they're at risk of being repeat victims. And then in my career, I've seen about a handful, maybe a dozen women who've offended against their children, and in every case, their offender was somebody of the same sex, so a woman. So if the abuse in childhood is done by a woman, then a woman who identifies as a woman is more at risk, but it's a much smaller proportion.
The Royal Commission is investigating, obviously, the church and, they say, and other communities like schools, but the whole thing is focusing on and drummed up on the church. But why is that? Why the certain focus on the church that much?
I think it's because the church is willing to take it, because I see it as a very hopeful thing that the church is opening itself up to scrutiny. People are very angry because they feel betrayed, but in actual fact there are far more people abused within their own family, and we don't touch that. That's too scary to talk about feeling betrayed by a family member. So talking about it in the church has led on to talking about it in the Defence Forces, in the Scouts, it will lead on to, I hope, a realisation that it's right through our society and we need to address it where it is.
It's much more rooted into the society than the institutions.
If we persist in using punishment, nobody wants to put up their hands. If we actually offer them an incentive to heal their families from the pain they've caused, people would own it. But this, as you mentioned, this kind of stigmatise yourself and your family forever by putting up your hand and saying, I did it. How many people are going to do that?
And I think also the law is prevent that, because if a psychologist has got a treatment from a sex offender, they must report to the police.
Well, that's not always the case. And in fact, mandatory reporting is different in each of the states. So it is still possible to get treatment, but the problem is that people don't know that. So people who feel, if I say anything to anybody, I'm going to end up in prison and ruin my family, it's only the people that get caught that actually get into that system where they can even have an opportunity of treatment. Everybody else has to keep it a secret. That's right. But the reality is that only a tiny proportion of what happens is caught by a very clumsy prison system, and only a tiny proportion are on sex offender registers, which doesn't protect people at all. The majority are in the community now and need help, and in a more positive way.
So what's your message finally for the politicians and for our society?
Open your eyes and see what will truly protect children from child sexual abuse. And when you realise that it's actually offering a more positive approach, change from this punitive approach, which is
not working.
It's a dead end, and change to a humanitarian, humane, compassionate concern for the children and families where this is occurring, and use the strength in those families and even in the offenders that says, I don't want to do this, I don't want my children to suffer. So we should be using the positive strengths and the compassion rather than the stick and the punishment and the throw away the key.
So we need to grow up.
Absolutely.
Christabel, thanks very much for your attendance today. Stay tuned and come back next week. One-on-one shadowboxing, same channel, same time.